Our Bible study for today comes from Mark chapter 6, and it's going to be verses 30 to 56. But technically for today's Bible study, we'll be looking at Mark 6, 30 to 44, and then 45 to 56 will be the sermon. This first section is a pretty important section. Very much worthy of us taking the time to dig into it. And how do we know that? Why do I say that? This story, known largely as the feeding of the 5,000, but it's the feeding of the 20,000, because it doesn't count women and children in the 5,000. This is the only miracle of Jesus that is reported in all four Gospels. So you know it's important. If that doesn't draw your eye, then nothing will. So let's dig into this famous, well-known, and well-loved story about Jesus feeding the hungry multitude. And we're going to read the whole section. The apostles gathered around Jesus and told him all they had done and taught. He said to them, "Come away to a deserted place all by yourself and rest a while." For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And they went away in the boat to a deserted place by themselves. Now many saw them going and recognized them, and they hurried there on foot from all the towns and arrived ahead of them. And as he went ashore, Jesus saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them because they were like a sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. When it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place. The hour is now very late. Send them away so that they may go into the surrounding country and villages and buy something for themselves to eat." But Jesus answered them, "You give them something to eat." They said to him, "Are we going to go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat?" And he said to them, "How many loaves have you? Go and see." And when they had found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Then he ordered them to get all the people to sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups of hundreds and of 50s. Taking the 5 loaves and 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to his disciples to set before the people, and he divided the 2 fish among them all. And all ate and were filled. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces, and of the fish, those who had eaten the loaves numbered 5,000 men. We know this story, right? It's familiar to us. Many of you could tell this story from memory. But here's the somewhat surprising thing about this story. It would have felt familiar to those who heard it for the first time. It would have felt familiar to those around 5,000 plus women and children that experienced it that first time. They would have found it familiar. And that's because it connects to 2 Kings chapter 4, verses 42 to 44, which says, "A man came from Baal Shalisha, bringing food from the first fruits to the man of God, 20 loaves of barley and fresh ears of grain in his sack. Elisha said, 'Give it to the people and let them eat.' But his servants said, 'How can I set this before 100 people?' So he repeated, 'Give it to the people and let them eat. For thus says the Lord, they shall eat and have some left.' He set it before them. They ate, had some left, according to the word of the Lord." Sound familiar? But these two stories, even though it's familiar, were told for very different reasons. One commentary put it this way: the incident about Elisha was probably told originally to glorify the wonder worker. In Mark, it attests the authority of Jesus and points to his relationship to his disciples and the crowd. On some level, it reminds me of the people surrounding Jesus in the Gospel of John when they see Jesus cry over the death of Lazarus, saying, See how he loved him. The crowd was overwhelming. They should look out for themselves. They should leave Jesus alone, for they asked too much, and yet, see how he loved them. See how he loves us. Verse 34 tells us, as he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. This phrase, the sheep without a shepherd, also appears in Matthew, but in another context, which means this was most likely a well-known phrase about Jesus that was circulating independently of either Mark or Matthew, which tells us something about this feeding story since Mark chose to place it here. Jesus is clearly the Good Shepherd. This section starts after Jesus sends out the disciples, and we find them already back. The apostles gathered around Jesus, and he told him all they had done and taught. He said to them, "Come away to a deserted place all by yourselves and rest a while. The Good Shepherd knows when rest is required for the flock and will provide it." Then in verse 35, when it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now very late. Send them away so that they may go to the surrounding country and villages and buy something for themselves to eat." But he answered them, "You give them something to eat." It's a little later, after that reading. Their rest plan had been ruined, but a new need has come up. They need to eat. All those people there need to eat. The Good Shepherd provides us rest, is caring enough to say when we need rest, provides us food, caring enough that we are fed. Even when it doesn't seem like there's enough time for rest, even when it seems like there's not enough nourishment around, whether nourishment of the body, mind, or soul, this Good Shepherd can turn even the lamest scraps into a bountiful feast. Now, another part of this section that we can't fail to highlight is that sacramental language, the communion language that's so obvious in this section, starting in verse 41. Take the 5 loaves and the 2 fish. He looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to his disciples to set before the people. Now we line this up with chapter 14, verse 22 of Mark. When they were eating, he took a loaf of bread and after blessing it, broke it and gave it to them. This is a sacramental, God-focused, God-connecting moment. The presence of God was with them in the wilderness. And we shouldn't skip over any wilderness references that are here. You just have to dig just a little bit. The phrase lonely place is repeated 3 times here, which is usually a reference to a desert or the wilderness. And there is a great crowd there. And listen closely to this part. They're eating magical bread and a protein. You see that connection? Not necessarily bread and fish, but manna and quail. Israel, off in the wilderness, being fed and cared for by God. One commentary noted, this feeding of the 5,000 points back to Moses in the wilderness and forward to the messianic feast at the end time. While the words describing Jesus' prayer and breaking of bread tie the scene contemporaneously to the Lord's Supper. Past, future, present. God will find you in the wilderness of your life, and through God's abundant love for us, God will feed us, care for us, and teach us. Hard to think of a better section for us to hear today in the midst of our own pandemic wilderness. Well, that is until we dig into the very next section, which helps to explain a few of our struggles and gives us some hope for growth. So we'll pick up that next section in the sermon. Thanks for joining me for today for this Bible study.